Hi everyone, my name is Jen and I'm a mobile engineer at Uber. Today I'm here to talk to you about mobile architecture. So first, a little bit about me. I studied engineering at Columbia, and before joining Uber, I worked at a payment startup called Clover. I am an iOS engineer, but I've also done Android development in the past. So if you'll first indulge me, let's take a trip back in time to 2009 and see what the Uber app looked like then. So not bad for its time, but it's pretty bare bones. We have the map, the pick me up button, but there's not much else to it. Now fast forward to 2012. This is Uber app version 2. We have additional functionality such as location search, ETA predictions, as well as product selection at the bottom. That was 4 years ago. Last year, we did a complete rewrite of the Uber app again, and this is what it looks like now. So we have additional functionality such as scheduled rides, accelerators for one-tap requests, as well as a feed, and many, many more. So as you can see, the app has evolved a lot over the years, as has the company and the engineering organization. So when we first embarked on this journey to rewrite the app last year, this is what our code base looked like. Okay, it probably wasn't that bad, but that's how it felt like sometimes. The previous version of the app was written in a way that was sustainable for a group of, a few dozen engineers. But as we grew to hundreds of mobile engineers and countless experiments, it was no longer sustainable. This is what we want the app to look like. Organized, manageable, and easy to add to. We wanted to rebuild it in a way that was both reliable and scalable. So the previous version of the app was written in MVC. Most of you have probably heard of MVC before, but just for a quick recap, we have the model, which is the data layer of the app, the view, which makes up the UI components that the user interacts with, and the controller, which is basically the glue between the model and the view. So the issue with MVC is that a lot of logic ends up in the controller, and the model and the view are very simple objects. This makes for very large controllers that are hard to understand, hard to debug, and even harder to test. So we built the new version of the app using Riblets. Riblets have a router, an interactor, a builder that instantiates the rest of the Riblet, a component that the builder uses for dependencies, and each Riblet can have a presenter and a view controller, or multiple presenters and multiple view controllers. For those of you that have used Viper before, this will look very familiar. You can think of Riblets as Viper with a Uber flavor. So the main benefit of Riblet is separation of responsibilities. What used to be done in the view controller is now broken up into the router, the interactor, and the presenter. The router is responsible for transitions between different views. The interactor holds all of the business logic. And the presenter manages all the presentation logic. Now you can test each portion of the Riblet independently of the others. So let's take a look at how we built the app using Riblets. Here we have main, which is the root of our app. We have a menu Riblet, which contains things like payments, past trips, and settings. We also have a ride Riblet that actually doesn't have any views, but looks at the state the user is in and determines whether to hook up the request Riblet or the trip Riblet. The request Riblet has the location editor, product selection, and feed. And the trip Riblet contains trip instructions and a feed as well. Now this is a very simplified rendering of what our rib tree looks like, but it kind of gives you an idea. So you'll notice that we have two feed Riblets. These are actually two instances of the same Riblet, and the reason we did this was because we wanted to maintain a separate feed, two separate feeds, one for when the user is requesting a ride, and one for when the user is on trip. So say, for example, at some future point in time, we wanted to just have one feed that the user sees both while they're on trip and before they start the trip. We could easily detach these riblets and reattach a riblet at the ride level. Now, this is accessible from both request and trip. Refactors like this are relatively easy in riblets, and in the MVC world, it would have been a lot more difficult. So sometimes we want to have multiple implementations of the same feature. Let's look at an example with trip instructions. Usually, we want to tell the rider to meet the driver at the designated location that they picked when they first requested the ride. But sometimes we want to ask them to walk a couple blocks for a better pickup. So we have walking instructions. Sometimes if they're at a large event, say a football game, we want to provide even more detailed instructions on how to get to the pickup area. So each of these versions of trip instructions has its own UI as well as its own data source. The way we implement this is to have a separate riblet for each of these different versions of this feature and hook it up to the rib tree through a plugin interface. The plugin interface contains a manager that can determine in real time which of these plugins make sense to show the rider. We can also easily turn off a plugin if we determine that it was causing issues in other parts of the app. So, through a combination of riblets and plugins, we were able to rewrite our rider app in 6 months. This was an effort that included 2 platforms and 30 different teams. Without such a scalable architecture, we would not have been able to do this in such a short amount of time. Today, we have more than 75 different self-contained modules that engineers can work inside of without having to worry about what's happening in the rest of the app. We have more than 100 experiments, all at different phases of rollout. And we've been able to maintain a crash-free rate of higher than 99.9%. Today, the app is much richer and more interactive than it was 7 years ago or even 4 years ago. I personally am looking forward to developing new features in this version of the app for years to come. Thanks.